really appreciate it. We, being the Public Affairs Department of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. My name is Peter Tarr. I'm the senior science writer in the department. We thank you for coming. We want to tell you just in advance, if you ever have any concerns about science, any curiosity, come and see our website. It's super duper. You've never seen one like it. cshl.edu, fantastical. And then we also have a podcast called Base Pairs, which is super interesting and award-winning, as a matter of fact. And the guy who just raised his hand is one of the MCs of the podcast. So you might want to go and look at that. And now that we've gotten the advertisements out of the way, thanks for coming. We are here to talk about science in a sort of entertaining sort of way. And to me, as I was thinking about how to introduce our speaker tonight, there's nothing more exciting in science really than the next generation of researchers. This is the way that science advances. New people come into the field and they ask really important questions in ways that the older and more experienced investigators actually are sort of self-blinded and are not able to ask anymore because of their experience. It's a paradox of science. So science moves forward, as Bruce Stillman, who's the president of the lab, has reminded us, because of this youth culture at the lab. And today is a great exemplar of it because Jessica Tollkuhn is one of 3 years ago she came here and established a laboratory. And the subject of her research was probably the thing that drew you here because of the title of our lecture tonight, which is Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And, you know, that's kind of a popular expression that plays on popular culture, sort of stereotypes of how men and women are different from one another and what makes them different. And Jessica's going to tell us some stuff tonight that really is, I think, going to confound some of the notions that you've grown up with, and I'm going to leave that all to her to talk about. But one thing I do want to do before letting her talk is to read to you from the blurb from Publishers Weekly about the book Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, which came out in 1993 by a guy named John Gray, who's a psychotherapist. The subtitle of the book is A Practical Guide for Improving Communication and Getting What You Want in Your Relationships. And sort of playing on that idea that men are a very particular type and women are a different type, and we can categorize those things in a rather simple way. And here's what the reviewer said. Psychotherapist John Gray adds to the growing number of self-help books that assess marital and relationship problems in terms of distinct and pervasive gender differences. Unfortunately, his overuse of gimmicky, often silly analogies and metaphors makes this otherwise down-to-earth guide hard to take seriously. Well, actually, this is a very serious subject, and Jessica is doing some research that is trying to figure out exactly what the role of hormones are in the brain and in how they, how the infusion of hormones and the sequence of hormonal action early in brain development determines who we are. Jessica comes from California originally, right? She's a native Californian. She earned, I think, a molecular biology degree at Mills College and got a PhD at University of California, San Diego, and did a postdoctoral period of research at UCSF, right? And the final thing I'm going to say before yielding the floor is that just in the past week, Jennifer has reminded me, or admitted to me, that Cold Spring Harbor is a gorgeous place. And, you know, I really took that to be a very important marker in our relationship because she comes from the Big Sur coast, and there's no probably more impressive coastline in North America better than Big Sur. She's here with her family, adding a lot of life and zest to the lab, and she can entertain us, but also educate us tonight about this subject matter, which we all think we know about, but we don't know as much as we think.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Great. So thanks everyone for being here. I've got like a full 270 of humans to speak to. Thanks also to Six Harbors for having us. This is a lovely, lovely space, and I'm really happy to speak to you tonight. Oh wait, what just happened? I have an error message.
Oh no.
Okay, so I'm going to talk tonight about the research that my lab does, and we study sex differences in the brain and behavior. And this is a really important topic right now because as more and more research is done and more data is collected from patients, it's becoming very clear that there are a lot of sex differences in normal physiology and in disease. So there are many diseases that have a sex bias in how they develop and how they present, in the incidence of diagnosis. So for example, women have more autoimmune conditions, men have more cardiovascular disease, and particularly with regards to the brain, there are a lot more early onset neurodevelopmental disorders in boys. So things like autism, ADHD, language disorders, dyslexia, all these things are diagnosed more frequently in boys than they are in girls. Now in adulthood and in adolescence, things sort of switch. And many more women are known to have anxiety, depression. That got a little louder.
Too much.
It's better? Okay. Anxiety, depression, eating disorders, whereas men have more problems with substance abuse. And so I'm not a clinician, but our work in the lab is really designed to identify the basic differences in men and women, in their brains, in how their brains develop, with the hope of identifying susceptibilities that we can then target for better treatments. Because if we understand the differences of how a disease can develop, we can understand why it's more likely to occur in one case than the other, and then we can hopefully target those biological processes for future interventions. So I'm going to start by clarifying something that is a kind of a pet peeve of mine, and this is the idea that sex and gender as concepts they're not interchangeable words. And this is something that I see again and again, even with my own fellow scientists. The idea, so that sex, right, when you talk about sex in an animal, you're talking about biological and physiological characteristics, right? So things that make you male or make you female, whether it's a Y chromosome or another biological feature. Whereas gender is really a social and cultural construct, right? So things that society decides are either masculine or feminine, right? So like different colors associated with boys or girls. I flipped them here on the slide. I don't know if anyone noticed. So people have these gender reveal parties for their children, but they're not really revealing the gender of their child. They've kind of done an ultrasound and they can guess whether the baby is male or female. And so it's really important to understand from a scientific perspective that animals don't have gender, right? Because gender is like a representation. Gender is how you think about things like, sparkly things are for girls and power tools are for boys or anything that's been taught to you. But that is entirely independent of your innate biology. So animals don't have gender. People often use gender when they talk about the gender of their mice in the lab, and that's actually just not okay. Actually, the World Health Organization defines these things separately. And so I have an example here to help you remember. The sex of this individual is male, but currently this individual is presenting very many feminine traits that are associated with a female, or not female, but a feminine gender, right? So these things can be different and can come in different levels and in different combinations. Okay, so what gives you your sex? Just as a reminder to everyone that maybe doesn't think about this all the time, so your DNA in your cell, the blueprint that makes you you, is packaged into these chromosomes. And males have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, and females have two XX chromosomes, right? And it's actually the presence of the Y chromosome that causes the body to develop testes. So if you don't have a Y chromosome, you're going to develop ovaries. As I think most people know, the testes make testosterone, and the ovaries make estrogen and progesterone. And these are the hormones that are typically associated with female, or being a female. However, I guess maybe the first surprise for today, the testes do also make some estrogen and progesterone. These things are present in men. And the ovaries also make some testosterone. So these are sex hormones. They're called sex hormones because they affect reproduction, and they're made by the gonads. And I'm going to talk a lot about sex hormones today because they're the primary source of sex differences in the body and brain. So what is a hormone, right? So a hormone is a really tiny molecule that goes all over your body. It's made in one area, and it can act in very many different areas, right? So hormones, sex hormones don't just affect your reproduction. reproductive system, but they affect your bones, your cardiovascular system, your metabolism. They can move all throughout your body and act on different sites. And they're they have a lot of really important actions on the brain as well. So things like testosterone and estrogen can affect your mood, they can affect your appetite, they can affect your level of actually anxiety. And we really don't know exactly how these hormones are acting in the body. We know that there's a definite relationship between something like testosterone and aggression. And we know that if you have an animal, for example, and you want to take it to the vet and get it fixed so that it stops peeing all over your house, what you're doing is you're actually removing the source of these hormones that are regulating these animals' behavior. So just to kind of set the stage before I move on, I'm going to be talking about testosterone and estrogen and what they're doing in the brains of males and females. So the first thing I want everyone to know about hormones is that their levels of hormones are very variable. And most of you are probably familiar with the menstrual cycle, that estrogen and progesterone in a woman's body fluctuates throughout the month, right? So you have high estrogen and high progesterone. But what many of you may not know is that testosterone also is quite variable and fluctuates as well. So in men, testosterone is highest in the fall and lowest in the spring. If you think about that, it's kind of interesting because it would time baby making so that the babies are born in the summer, which is kind of neat and probably good for the species. Testosterone is also higher in the morning than it is in the evening. And testosterone secretion is really pulsatile, which means that it's not constant all the time, even within the day. It goes up and down. It's released in spikes throughout the body, throughout the day. So the other thing I want to emphasize is there's a really wide range of normal, right? So men on average have like 14 times as much testosterone as women, but there's a fourfold range of what is normal for men, and there's a fourfold range of what is normal for women within those relative limits. So this means that a man with a normal, healthy, but low amount of testosterone actually only has 4 times as much as a woman with normal, healthy, but high levels of testosterone, which is really not that different in terms of biology. So as hormones change in your body, they also can change your behavior. So there's something that's called the winner effect that's been observed in animals and also people. And this is the idea that after an animal wins a fight, they actually get a burst of testosterone in their circulation that makes them more likely to win the next fight. It feels really good when you win a fight. And it's actually been shown in humans that humans also have this winner effect. So if they are in a situation where they're challenged and they come out on top, that they get a little kind of hit of testosterone in their system that ramps them up for the next time. And even watching your own team win in a sporting event can cause a release of testosterone in your circulation because you're identified with that team and you know that they won and that you won and you're so excited you're going to run out in the street and smash store windows. So this is the winner effect, and this is true across many different species. This is in males, right? Yeah, so women do have pulsatile testosterone, but their levels do not reach as high as the men. Yeah, I should say, actually, I didn't say earlier, if anyone has any questions about clarification of what I'm saying, definitely ask me in the middle. Otherwise, just wait until the end and then we can answer my questions. So if something doesn't make any sense, please interrupt me. And then, okay, so during fatherhood, there are also studies that show that the amount of time that the dad spends with the infant actually correlates with reduced testosterone. And this is good, this is good for animals, this is good for humans. Historically, it's good if you have lower testosterone. Maybe you'll stick around more, maybe you won't be looking for another mate, maybe you won't get in as many fights and you'll still be there, maybe you won't eat the babies, depending on what kind of species you are. But these are all really important aspects of biology. Like you want these hormones to be plastic and dynamic, right? You don't want to have high testosterone all the time. It sounds like a good idea. It's not good for your body. It's not good for your behavior. It wastes energy and resources and it makes you engage in risky behavior. So kind of just the take home is that even within, part of normal human biology is that these hormones have a lot of variability in their highs and their lows. So my lab is studying how these hormones act on the brain to influence behavior. As I said earlier, we know that there's a very simple relationship between very high levels of testosterone and aggression. This does not exist for baseline testosterone, so you can't just take a random sampling of all the men in this room and how much testosterone they have and say that, you know, the ones that have the most testosterone are the angriest or the most aggressive. It doesn't work like that. There's correlations between extremes, right? If you give a lot of extra testosterone, you might be more likely in a lab task, a psychological exam, to appear more aggressive. So the big kind of interesting take-home, I guess the first of the two big interesting take-homes that is the most fun for me, and that I'm going to talk about today, is really how these hormones are working inside of cells. This is where we get a little sciencey nerdy. So this blobby thing is a schematic of a cell in your body, and the hormones are the little blue dots are your hormones, a hormone, a sex hormone that's moving around in your circulation. So something that's important about sex hormones is they can actually float right through into your cells from the blood. They don't have to bind anything, they're very fatty little molecules, and they can just diffuse on in. And so when they go into your cell, they bind these receptors that are already floating around in the cell. And so it's these receptors for the hormones that really exert all of the actions of that hormone on the body. Now the really interesting part comes when you move into the nucleus. So the nucleus is where we keep all of our DNA, and it's the DNA that's really deciding, you know, who you are and how you are viewed. So the DNA is the same in every cell in your body, more or less. It's the instructions for how to make you and how to operate you. But the really important thing to know about DNA is that not all of the parts that it can make are arrayed in all of your cells, right? Like you don't want a lot of keratin protein in your eyes. That would be really bad. It would be hard to see. And so understanding how a cell decides which genes it's going to use in each of your cells is a major focus in biology. So what hormones can do when they bind to their receptors is they can go into the nucleus and they can actually sit down on the DNA and directly turn genes on and off. And this can happen on a fairly quick time scale, right, in less than an hour. And this is really, really interesting if you think about it, right? This means that what hormones are doing when they move around your body and they sit down in cells, you know, in your bones or in your brain, that they're directly turning genes on and off in a fairly rapid way. So this means that men and women are actually expressing or using different genes in their brains in response to these different hormones. So many of these differences are set up in early life. It's not just what you have acutely, whether you have testosterone or estrogen, but really what's happening to you during development. So just a little schematic here. This is just a graph, you know, showing years of age, and testosterone levels, T here, goes up at puberty, right? So I think this is pretty familiar to everyone. What many of you may not know is that testosterone is also quite high during early life. So during the second trimester of development, testosterone levels are almost as high as they are at puberty. And there's another surge of testosterone during infancy. So like a 4-month-old baby has about as much testosterone as a 12-year-old boy. Yes. Right?
Explains a lot.
So we don't really know very much about what these early hormones are doing. We don't know, we don't know where the hormone receptors are in the brain during this time. It's really hard to do this kind of research. We also know that girls don't have early estrogen during fetal development, but they also have an infant surge of estrogen. And I've put it in a dotted line here because the data are pretty sparse. So we know that there is estrogen, there's a surge, but there haven't really been routine studies to figure out how long or how high that surge is. Okay, so it's really hard, as I said, to figure out what these hormones are doing. But one thing that the data are pretty clear on is that fetal testosterone levels correlate with childhood toy preference. So as childhood toy preference, right? So as many of you with children may have observed, despite your best intentions to try to make everything equal, boys often have very strong boy-type preferences, and girls have very strong girl-type preferences. Boys, at least my boys, turn everything into guns. I was a pretty big tomboy as a kid. I didn't try to kill everything. You know, it's just. Girls are more likely to have certain toy preferences as well. Now, and this can be done, you know, in the lab where you just give kids a bunch of stuff and see how much time they spend picking up and playing with different things. Now, it's really difficult to dissociate the social constructs and the developmental constructs here, right? Because you don't know if a girl's been given dolls her whole life, and then you just put her in a room with dolls, that's what she's seeing, so maybe that's what she's more likely to pick up. So there are a couple kind of experimental circumstances where we know that girls who have experienced high testosterone during development, during fetal development, because of endocrinology and mutations, those girls will actually go up and grow up and as children show boy-type toy preferences, and they'll also show increased aggressive play behavior. So boys have rough and tumble play behavior more than girls do. This is true in monkeys, this is true in rats in the lab. You can quantify play behavior in rats. And if you actually give a female rat testosterone during development, she'll grow up and she'll engage in more play behavior, as a juvenile rat. So in my lab, we study sex differences in mice. This is a mom with her babies. Because there's only so many kind of test cause and hypothesis or cause and consequence hypotheses that you can propose in humans. We work in mice. We study their behavior as parents, we study their mating, we study their aggression. So there's many sex differences in behavior that are evolutionarily conserved in mice and other rodents, as I said. And what we can do in the lab is we can manipulate hormones and we can test the effects of these hormones on how their brain develops, on their behavior, on the genes that they express in different parts of their brain. So any questions right now? Okay. So just to sort of compare to the humans, I showed that humans have this surge in early life, or in fetal development, that is very strong, high testosterone. In contrast, in mice, they have a very simple pulse that comes out on the day that they're born. The testes are active for a few hours. There's a high surge of testosterone that's almost at the level of puberty, and then it's gone, right? So it's a very nice, simple system that we can test in the lab because you can inject testosterone into females, and then you can look at their behavior as adults. So we know that early testosterone is required for adult aggressive behavior. If you have a mouse in his own cage, he thinks that's his cage, you put in an intruder mouse, the mouse is going to attack that intruder and try to defend its territory. Female mice also display sexual receptivity, so the fact that they will hold still when they're in estrus and they're fertile, and they'll allow a male to mate. If you take a male mouse and you give him lots of female hormones, he's not going to be sexually receptive because that early testosterone blocked the formation of those neural pathways that regulate that behavior. Okay, so here's the second take-home point that is kind of fun that I want everyone to remember. So this is a little wonky. This is a picture of the chemical testosterone. And as I've said, testosterone is made in the testes and it's secreted into the circulation where it can move around in different parts of your body. But what happens in the brain, and actually in many other parts of the body, this testosterone can be converted directly into estrogen. And the reason I've shown these little diagrams is actually just to point out that these are very similar looking molecules. Right? Testosterone and estrogen are almost the same thing. And in fact, all estrogen is actually made from testosterone. So ovaries are full of testosterone. They just happen to turn most of it into estrogen before it's released into the circulation. So the interesting thing in mice that has been found is it's actually this estrogen that's made directly in the brain that is really doing this masculinization in early life. And this is very counterintuitive because estrogen is thought of as a female hormone. It does regulate female behaviors, even in mice. But if you have estrogen early, it can actually cause your brain to be permanently masculinized. So I'm just going to show what that looks like here. If you have estrogen for a mouse, if a mouse sees estrogen in early life, then it permanently masculinizes the brain. Yeah. So the body, and I'm going to demonstrate that here. So the body of a female mouse that sees estrogen during its first week of life is still feminized, she still ovulates, she does everything she needs to do, but her brain is permanently masculinized by this early hormone.
And your determination of masculine or masculine,
Yeah.
traits like the
That's a really good question, that's right. So you could almost consider mouse behavior to be their gender roles as far as researchers are concerned, because it's the only readout, it's a readout that we can take of their sort of internal state, right? Yeah, so so I'm going to illustrate that in these videos here. So here, in both of these videos, the black mouse is the female, and the white mouse is the male. And this mouse is sexually receptive, right? So she's holding still, she's letting the male mate and do his thing. Mice have a very fast 4-day estrus cycle, and females will actually only hold still and let the males mate if they're in estrus, which is when they're ovulating, right? Like, why waste your time? It's not going to make sense. So if this mouse was not in estrus, she would kick and run away and would just not be interested. So we've given this mouse high estrogen and progesterone to ensure that she will hold still and be sexually receptive, the behavior I referred to earlier. Okay, so in this video now, this female is exactly the same. She has high estrogen and progesterone, but she was given estrogen during her first week of life. And so now the same hormones, rather than causing sexual receptivity, I can show that again, actually induce aggression. So if she has high estrogen and progesterone, those hormones are acting on a brain that was masculinized in early life by estrogen. So she's now performing male-typical behaviors. Female mice don't ever attack like this.
That's a different black.
It's a different black female. So we gave them estrogen and progesterone in adulthood to make sure that they were in estrus, the same hormone treatment. But the second video, the female was given estrogen during her first week of life as well. And so that estrogen is enough to have very long-lasting effects on how her brain develops and how she interprets social signals, social cues, all these other things. So in my lab, we want to know what genes estrogen regulates in early life and in adults, right? So how is it that estrogen early is making your brain male, but estrogen in adulthood has, normal female physiology, facilitates sexual receptivity, facilitates pregnancy and parenting. So these are the major questions that we're focusing on right now. So I just want to leave you with kind of this concept that biology is diverse and full of surprises, and things might not go the way that you expect, or they might actually proceed the way that you thought maybe when you walked in here. Estrogen is important for males too. So this in human males, estrogen is important for bone health and for fertility and metabolism. It's also possibly important for mood, but it's very difficult to study this. So there's this aromatase enzyme that converts testosterone to estrogen that's also present throughout the male body and in the male brain of humans. And I also just want to kind of, again, mention the diversity and the range of what is considered normal, because the Mars and Venus thing is a very strong dichotomy, and we know that nature is not really like that, right? So there are many women who have high testosterone who are still women. So similar to what I mentioned earlier, girls that are exposed to testosterone early in life, or maybe have higher levels of circulating testosterone that's considered normal. But also many women are also genetically male. So everyone in this picture here actually has an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. So if you were just going to look at their cells, you think, oh, these are male cells, these are men. But there can be a disconnect in biology between what's in your genes and what's in the rest of your body. And there's a wide range of normal, and it's important to understand the diversity that's there in the population, and we can learn a lot about ourselves as humans that way. So I think with that, I'm going to take questions, and yeah, thanks.
Sorry. Thank you. You said when the female is.
I don't think that's on.
You
Yeah.
said
Oh, don't look.
hold on a moment. I have a pretty loud voice.
Yeah.
You said when the female is influenced by estrogen early, how would that happen? How would that happen? What's an example of that?
So in humans, so the question was, thank you, the question was how would females get influenced by estrogen early, right? So I was talking about mice, and we gave them estrogen with injections, right, to sort of mimic this testosterone surge that's normally happening in the male. So if you give a female testosterone injections, you'll masculinize her brain, but you'll masculinize like the reproductive tract, it'll kind of start to screw everything up. But the estrogen alone affects the brain, but then her ovaries and uterus and everything develop normal. Yeah. Just to say also, rodents that were studied in the lab seem to be very estrogen-driven for masculinization, but humans and other primates tend to use the receptor for testosterone more, so that's androgen receptor. So humans are using this early testosterone to masculinize more than, because we're developing in the mom, and the mom's got really high estrogen, and that's not going to masculinize.
What's the question?
There's a question in the back.
I'm right there too.
Yeah, I'm here too.
Where?
Right there.
Okay. We'll do this one first.
This is really interesting, thank you.
Thanks.
Have you any thoughts on transgender and is that hormonally? Is
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So in my lab, we study two brain regions there's actually a few brain regions that have different numbers of cells that are larger in males than they are in females. There's also a couple regions that are larger in females compared to males. So these regions are really thought to regulate like reproduction and fertility. But people have shown that this size difference in these brain areas is also present in humans. And there has been one study that's actually looked post-mortem at men and women and homosexual men and men who identify as women. And in the men who identify as women, they had a smaller, more female-sized brain region. So this sort of speaks to the idea that, people say they feel like they're in the wrong body, and could really be that there's parts of their brain that did develop like the other sex. We just don't have a lot of data on figuring out what different parts of the human brain are really doing for our personalities.
What's your answer?
So, hi. So right now, there's a controversy in sports. There's a female runner who has high levels of testosterone.
Yeah.
And she dominates her event.
So I'm not showing Castor, I showed the other one, but yes.
And so they're proposing to change the rules to eliminate her ability to compete.
Yeah.
Does she have an unfair advantage?
I mean, this is another really good question. So I think Castor Semenya is her name, and she's a South African runner, and she's been doing very well. And she has also, like the woman I'm showing here, higher levels of circulating testosterone than is normal in the population, right? And there are actually now have been proposals that these women that are reaching these elite levels that are getting tested and being found to have higher testosterone, well, maybe they should take hormone therapy to lower that testosterone. Maybe that's giving them an unfair advantage. In the London Olympics, many of these women were forced to undergo hormone treatment if they wanted to compete. And I think, I'm personally not okay with that. I mean, I'm not on the International Olympic Committee, and I'm not a clinician, but I think there are so many innate biological advantages that can make people an elite athlete, right? Like if you train at altitude, if you have really long limbs, there are many different aspects of biology that by the time you're at this top level, is that what gave you the edge, or is it because you started as a kid and you had better training? I feel like if people have been raised as women and identify as women, then they should be allowed to compete as women. I mean, that's my personal opinion, but I'm not making these decisions.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
When you say many women, you mean many people that are their gender is woman?
Yes.
Because they're
Well, this is where we don't know, right?
But
So
if they're genetically male, then they have, which is the female, they have YY.
these have XY. These women have XY like a male. So the women in this picture have what's known as androgen insensitivity syndrome. So they can't respond to testosterone. So they develop through their whole lives looking like girls, but they don't have female reproductive organs. They have internal testes that are in their abdomen that are secreting testosterone, and there's no way to respond to the testosterone, but the testosterone can be converted into estrogen. So these women undergo puberty because the testosterone comes out, it gets converted to estrogen, and they look like women. They develop breasts, and they just don't have. So that I don't know. I mean, the answer to your question: are they women?
Males are YY. No.
Males are XY, and women are XX.
XX. So,
Yeah.
so it's the Y thing that makes you male and develop.
It's the Y that gives you testes versus ovaries. But then if your testes don't make testosterone, then you're sort of in this middle ground. Yeah.
Thank you.
Those women are not transgender, they're not identified, they're actually.
I mean, they think they're women. They were raised as women. Their parents thought they were women. A lot of this time, it doesn't get diagnosed until they realize they're trying to get pregnant, and then they can't because they don't have a uterus. Yeah.
I'm a little confused about something. In the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that gender is a social construct.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, sparkling things versus power tools.
Yeah.
And it has to do with how you're raised, I guess, and society's expectations.
Right.
But then you went on to start talking about all the hormones and how they change the brain, and then the brain changes behaviors.
Yeah.
So couldn't sparkly things in hormones be something determined by?
Well, it's sort of like asking like, why do people like a certain kind of art, right? Like
Yeah.
it's your personal preferences in life they could be. The toy preference example that I gave, you're right, does contradict what I said earlier, because that does seem to be fairly determined. People have actually looked at monkeys and put trucks and dolls down in the jungle and watched monkeys, and the boy monkeys will play with the trucks more, and the girl monkeys will play with the dolls more, right? So what this means is, maybe the girl monkeys are socialized to be around babies more, so they think the doll looks like a baby, they've seen babies more, but and the truckers, right? But so yeah, that is an example where and there are many sex differences. I'm trying to think of a good example right now. Men generally do better on tests where they have to mentally rotate an object, right? Women tend to do better on certain verbal parameters, right? So, but again, with humans, you can never really dissociate how people were raised their whole life. People tend to talk to girl babies more and encourage boy babies to explore more. There's a fun BBC thing you can watch on YouTube where they dressed kids in the opposite gender clothes and then gave them to people and, saw what they wanted the kid to do.
I guess you could probably say there's sort of a baseline distribution of chemistry, and
Yeah.
you overlay that with culture, and
Exactly.
the truth is somewhere in between, basically, and it's complicated, I guess.
Well,
Yeah,
like the
yeah.
color blue did not become associated with boys until the 20th century, right? It used to be like light blue was for the Virgin Mary, and it was a very female color. And so when I say like social construct, it's what it means to be, masculine or feminine that changes depending on
I think what I heard is it used to be that boys were considered to reflect the glory of heaven and sort of blue sky, and then women weren't, but I guess they're different.
Culture.
All right, yeah.
No culture. I just want to, terrific presentation.
Thanks.
Love the lab. But with the LGBTQ community and what you're doing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if something happens in the womb that changes the trajectory?
Yeah.
And so this is not, I mean, just going further down, and I understand that this is, work that you're doing, but compared to people that think this is a choice,
Yeah.
you might be documenting that this is not an option, and something happens in the womb, am I correct?
Yeah, there are a lot of kind of epidemiological studies across populations. So it's known that boys who have a lot of older brothers are more likely to be homosexual, and that's because the mother's body actually starts to block testosterone. After, like, the mom will make antibodies to testosterone herself, after she has all this testosterone in her. And over time, the testosterone that the boys make, there's like less and less of it available to them after multiple pregnancies. But is that enough alone? It's not like high testosterone makes you straight and low testosterone makes you, right? There's a range of everything, and there's a combination of, many genetic factors and environmental factors. It's thought, but there's really no way to, like, at the moment, information about sexual preference is very difficult compared to making conjecture about sexual identity. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. This has been really incredibly informative.
Thank you.
We hear a lot about BPA and phthalates and hormone disruptors in our environment. How do they play into development?
Yeah, I actually almost put a slide up about that. There have been, I'm not clear on the human data, again, I'm not a clinician, but there's definitely studies in lab animals, certainly things like frogs, where these endocrine disruptors do mimic these hormones, and they do affect sexual development, and you can get things like, frogs with ambiguous genitalia because of being exposed to these hormones. That's definitely, that's a true thing, right? So we don't know whether just drinking things from plastic is enough to give you that level that it would really affect, because it's very hard to do a controlled study across many people on what's actually causal for other things. But yes, chemicals like BPA and phthalates do mimic these hormones and their effects in the brain and in other parts of the body. That's definitely true.
Hi, I've been seeing a lot on nature programs about mating practices with different animals, and they've often shown that you have like the very masculine male in, say, monkey truth, or even with cuttlefish, they'll have a very large male, and he'll be like the leader of all of them. There's always these sneaky males who seem to have, they're winning. No, I didn't. But they often like either mimic females, so they can sneak past the aggressive larger males, or they have, they'll like cuddle babies more, they'll hold them, they'll be more nurturing, and the females sneak away with these guys a lot.
Yep.
And so, like that's thought, and
Birds
that's really,
do this.
isn't that really all the purpose of the whole thing, is to pass the
Yeah.
genes on?
So there are many
A
strategies.
rainbow, right? So that's keeping the animal kingdom.
The other, that's definitely true. There's a lot of time where the female will have like the one that's strutting around and then the other one on the side, and like this all happens in nature. And I think what was I going to say about this? Oh yeah, so there is thinking about the importance of once you're in a really large social group and you're living in a very complex society, that what you really want is to benefit. You want traits, characteristics that benefit your offspring, right? But what if you have in your extended family, males that aren't running around trying to mate, but they're sticking around the house or the, whatever, cave. But they're present in the population with and actually benefiting, their nieces and nephews or other aspects of society, right? There are a lot of ways to build up the strength of your genes in your gene pool in your family, besides just going out and sowing your wild oats as much as you can, right? So this is true in many animals that live in large social groups, where there's maybe one that does all the mating, but the other males do a lot of other stuff that's really good for them.
I guess my question was, are those males also ones that might have more estrogen and less testosterone, because they seem to exhibit more female characteristics, either smaller size or
yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot. I'm not a complete expert on all of these species, but I do know that there are in animals that live in groups. There's often reproductive suppression, like even of the other females, where there'll be a queen. This is true in some like rodent populations that live in colonies, but there'll be one female that makes all the babies, and the other females actually aren't even cycling. There's like social proximity so they're not even engaging in any reproductive behavior. They're just running around and getting food and helping the queen. And so there's a lot of variation in like what hormones, how high they are, and which combinations are present. Right.
Hi, Jessica. It's me.
Oh, David. Hi. Hi, Amelia.
So I was just wondering, you mentioned how our lab is currently studying different genes that potentially might be regulated by estrogen receptors. Could you talk about, do you have any interesting candidate genes? Do they have any parallels to humans? Any fun applications?
Yeah, so I could get super sensitive data here, but we've been looking in the brains of animals, both in pups and in the babies and in the adults, and looking at how estrogen turns genes on and off in certain parts of the brain. And there are some really interesting genes that are coming out of this that we've identified, and one in particular that I'm not going to mention is involved in pain perception, and it seems like it's actually down-regulated by estrogen, right? So if you had lower estrogen, you would have more of this thing that's involved in pain, and so that would give you kind of, who knows what that actually means. But there's definitely a relationship between hormones, there's sex differences in pain perception, and chronic pain definitely is more common in women. So yeah, we're finding genes that have not been known to be regulated by hormones before that are really interesting in the brain that we think are really fundamental to biology.
Jessica, thank you very much. We all thank you very much.